3.
Okay.
Okay.
Should we go?
No.
Good morning. How are you?
Yeah, good. How are you?
Good.
No, oh, wow. I'm next week. But it's important also. Yeah. It's gonna take a while. I know. But I bet it feels better than what it was. It does. That's 600.
Yeah. Is it covered? Guaranteed. We gotta get it done before the end of the year though. Or we're gonna have the 4th year in a row. Of saving trees.
Hello, lady. And they're new coat or bud.
I can't move boots all day.
So much stronger than they said because of the trauma to the wind. It'll take.
No, no, super. About leaf lights. Yeah. That's all. Actually, it's good in.
Staying up better now?
I can do that.
I'll have.
No, boots. Why did I not think of that?
Yeah.
I almost stuck it in. I'm gonna be one of those.
Jason here?
I'm sorry?
Is Jason here?
Yeah, he's teaching class.
That's what I was thinking. Okay.
Oh.
Whatever.
He is. Hi.
Hello, hello. How are you? You have a good Thanksgiving?
Only one.
Did they feed you?
Yeah.
He
Yeah,
told
we
me
are.
what, that's the
did.
yeah.
Oh, cool.
And here's doing that. Okay, and we'll be trying to.
Hopefully, that's our plan. Yeah. He said it there several times.
So many things you don't, you have throughout the year, but you.
Oh,
He filled in.
I bought a couple of turkeys. I froze them.
He was been fishing today, but I think too.
Yes.
What's up, man?
It was mostly girls, so, yeah. All right.
Messing with us.
Don't get to the building thing. We can do right now.
I mean, I don't know. Either way.
That's what she does. I mean, yeah.
Things like her.
We got plenty of like stuff.
Oh.
We're like talking and not leave DNA.
Thank you.
You're getting shout out and that's.
You know what?
Shout out and this is the things.
That sounds like a preparatory like warning.
I've been in that before.
You too?
No.
All the people get on my nerves.
And thank you for the people that be on my nerve, people be patient.
People I have to see Wade twice a week. You too.
Well, some people I'm gonna be traveling.
Can't get my boot in my room. No, need one more room. I do, I can't get my boot and it's too big. This is the second problem I've had with the boots this morning.
Break it through.
No, it's for my back. It's easier if I prop my feet up.
If I get enough turkey
I'm still eating. I love it so much.
to eat some cranberry sauce, like that's. I was telling my brother, we're having this conversation. This is literally the only time the entire year where we ever eat cranberry sauce. There's one day. Yeah, it's in the store all the time, I think. I don't know. Same thing with the pumpkin. Yeah, so we use that quite a bit. Grandma makes all kinds of pumpkin stuff. The cranberry, this one day a year.
All right, I don't know what's going on. This thing has a mind of its own today, so. I turn around and it maybe,
3 slides ahead.
yeah, I move that off.
All right, so we're gonna continue our discussion of the church today. So you got me for, I think, 4 weeks in a row. And then Darren for the last 2. So that's your warning. So today, this is a really appropriate verse out of Acts. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and in the breaking of bread and in prayers, right? So that's really been the goal of the class so far. The objective of the quarter is to be able to do all the things that are listed right there, right? And do them in a way that is pleasing to the Lord. So the way that we'll work through the next 4 lessons, and I feel like this is kind of the meat, if you will, of this quarter. We talked about some fundamental things and kind of laid a base to start with, and then this is really where we start to get into more practical application and you know, kind of flush out the work of the church. So Dave just kind of talked about the local church. So if you remember back in lesson 3, we talked about the universal church. So Dave will focus on the local church, and then we'll talk about how it's organized next week. And then the next week is what the mission is. And the week after that is what the mission is not. Right. So that's the way that we'll work through the next couple of weeks. You know, it's interesting when you think about it. God has never, regardless of where we are, what dispensation, what part of the Bible we're working in, God's never left man in a situation where it was not clear what was pleasing to God and what was not. Right. So that's kind of the spirit that we want to continue to work through things here this morning. So let's get started with the word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day that we have to come together to worship you. Thankful for the time this week that we've been able to spend with our families and mindful of all the blessings that you've given us this week. Thankful that you brought us here this morning, that we can study your word. Pray that you help us to be wise in how we discern and divide your word, and that we would encourage each other, and that we would come out of this morning stronger with a better understanding of what it is that you would have us to do. Let's call these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're going to jump right into the questions here. And this should be a bit of a review. But question 1, in what ways does the New Testament use the word church? So there's more than one. That's why that's the question, right?
Local group of Christians,
Okay.
that assemble together.
Yeah, so Christians that work together in a specific area. That's one. What else?
But Jesus establishing his church.
Yeah, so what we we're calling the universal or the general or the generic church, right? And that's the body of all the believers, right? Everyone who's saved is part of the universal church. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. And then really, I guess it's important to also mention, because it does occur a couple of times, just ecclesia can be used generically for any assembly, right? The stadium on Friday nights has an ecclesia, right? There's a gathering, an assembly of people to watch football over there. Okay, so it's important to make sure that we understand the differences between the universal and the general church and the local church. Why is that important?
There's different accountabilities based on the relationship involved.
Yeah, so the local church is called upon to assemble, to organize itself, to carry out collective responsibilities. That's not necessarily the case when you're talking about the general church. And so when there's confusion on what is applied to one gets applied to the other, right? We start to have problems and get away from the pattern and the things that are laid out in the New Testament.
All right, good. So that's a review of that serves as our review of lesson 3. Okay, so what problems can arise? So we said there can be problems. So what kinds of
problems? Question 2. Anybody got an example or a thought or comment on what, maybe a type of problem?
Well, usually, a lot of times, it seems like it involves the responsibility of money and how people can use that money, whether it, and when you talk about the local church versus then saying, oh, well, this local church is going to give to this other bigger group that's going to do it. So it's a lot of times it's trying to, specifically with money, trying to lump those two together and say, oh, well, whatever the local church can do, you can do it as a big universal group. I'm kind of rambling, but
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think at the end of the day, really what it comes down to is
organizational structure and remembering that the general church, the universal church, there is no organization to it, right? Specifically, if you remember, I didn't have room to put them up here. At the last lesson, we had the 3 circles at the bottom, right? You have the universal church, which is made up of all the believers of all times, across all time, across all places, all geography, right? That's the universal church. And then we kind of contrasted that and said, what it's not, the universal church is not a collection of local churches. Now, are local churches included in the universal church? They are, because the local group is made up of saved people who are in a certain area, right? The universal church is made up of saved people everywhere. So by necessity, right, the local church is part of the universal church, but it's, I guess, making sure that we're clear on how we think about it. Okay. The universal church is made up of people who happen to be in a local church, right? It's not made up of local churches in and of themselves.
If you misunderstand that, it's easy to then take it and say, okay, well, it would make efficiency, or it makes sense efficiency wise to, okay, we have to have districts, we have to have, multiple levels of accountability to then have oversight and all, and that's just something that naturally flows from it if you don't see it the way that the scripture shows.
And also, you can be a member of a local church and your brother not know what you're up to, but the Lord remove you from the universal church because he absolutely knows our secret sins. And so you can be assembling and not be right with the Lord.
Yeah, so that's definitely, we'll talk about that a little bit later, right? But there's definitely, there's no mistakes that are made in the universal church membership, right? Sometimes you can make mistakes, either including or excluding people who should be included, right? Paul, when he was converted and tried to worship with the brethren, they're like, hey, I don't know about this, right? So we can make mistakes on that side of things. To Jonah's point, God does not make mistakes, right? He knows, and is the ultimate arbiter of who is in the relationship with him and who is not, right? And then the other idea that we talked about, and there's a lot of this today, right? Is that the universal church is all who profess to follow Christ, and then all of the various flavors of denominations are kind of what is collectively lumped together to make up the universal church, right? So again, when you think about the application of that, right? So, how we work together, or, how, denominations choose to work together, very much follows that idea, right? Hey, we have these things in common, so we can work together, towards this common goal, because we're all part of the bigger group. And so things start to get a little sideways and away from, what was intended when we start to do that. All right. Question 4, right? This one should be pretty straightforward, but we're probably gonna spend a few minutes on this one today. But what is, explain what a local church is.
I almost do it for me. Jesse's answer. Was it? He might be in the auditorium. You ask him. It's a group of people who have agreed to work under a common oversight using a pooled resources. Man, he's got this answer down. I've heard it so many times in my life. I'm embarrassed. I can't get it out all the way.
Okay. So it's a group of people who have something in common, working under
A common oversight,
common oversight. Okay,
pooling the resources together.
okay, using their resources together to function as a group. I guess you could say it that way, right? What else? Anybody else got any other thoughts? Okay, so we'll kind of put up here 5 or 6 things, and then we'll walk through each of these a little bit, right? So if you remember, I think back in the very first lesson, we talked about the word church, right? And what that is a called out people. And when you sort of pair that together with the English derivative of the word church, right? Called out people belonging to the Lord, right? That gives you a really good idea of what that is. Okay. Then we have the local church, right? So it's limited to a certain area or location. And I started thinking about this today. Could we have someone who lives in California be a member of West Main?
Not unless they're commuting quite a bit.
Okay, so that was the first thing, right? So in this day and age, I guess it's possible that someone could take off on Sunday morning in California, land in DFW, come to the building, get on a plane and fly back home, right? That is not impossible to do today. Would that qualify as them being part of our local group? Right, so does being in the auditorium on Sunday morning qualify someone to be, does that make them a part of the local group?
No, because we have other responsibilities to each other, to be involved in each other's lives, to know each other, to help strengthen each other, to hold each other accountable. And if all you're doing is assembling and jetting, I don't know how you can fulfill those other responsibilities.
Okay, so what about the same thing? So let's switch technologies a little bit, right? So talk about the online
Yeah, so
opportunities that we have, right?
So if somebody from California was, consistently, diligently getting on live stream and worshiping, maybe it's not just him, maybe it's 3 or 4 people together. And they could even, because they feel compelled to, they could even send money here to the congregation and give. I mean, there's nothing that says, visitors or people can't. But to me, the thing comes down to a little bit what Joanna said. At the same time, the elders then have a responsibility over those souls that are in their local congregation. And how can they do that with people that they don't see?
Yeah.
I mean, like there's another step there for the elders to sit down, meet with them, discuss things, and not allow them, but take that step, and that because they're the ones that are ultimately responsible for their souls. So I don't know how that happens. So the people could worship, whether they're here, live stream, they could give money, they could do all those things, but I don't know that they could effectively, under God's plan, be part of this local congregation. I mean, that's my thought.
If there's a group of them, they can start their own work.
Yeah, but I mean, to your
Sure.
example, this hypothetical, I don't see how that
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah.
Any other?
I mean,
Right,
it sounds like judgment, is very much a part here, but.
yeah, for sure.
Okay, let's say, someone living in Los Angeles, oh, that's too far. Okay, well, what about someone living in Fort Worth? Like
Sure.
what point is it, you know what I mean? And I heard Tim, talking to somebody the other day, Tim Torno, and he was saying about, we had some visitors or something, and he was, I think they were from like Mesquite or something, and so he was saying like, hey, they're thinking about like placing membership or doing something. And he's like, well, I just feel the need to tell you, like, you're driving past another sound congregation, like 30 minutes closer to you.
Yeah,
And so, I mean, there's wisdom in that, I mean, to join it. Like, it's not just the elders looking out for you, but you have a whole lot of responsibilities to other Christians. And can you fulfill those obligations?
Yeah, there's a difference between, we have elderly people who are shut in. Who we still consider members of this group, and they haven't been outside of their room in years.
Yeah.
We do that as a, out of love for those folks. But they're also not leaving their room for anything else, you know what I mean? They are literally shut in,
yeah,
infirmed. And we are still caring for their souls. And if they can log on, great, good for them, that they could be encouraged that way, but that's not a substitute for meeting with the body when you can.
yeah,
But then on the flip side, my parents, when they lived down in Junction, they worshiped in Kerrville. And the congregation only met once on Sundays, and that wasn't because of like here, it was everybody lived.
yeah, far away,
everybody-
yeah,
A large group of the local congregation lived an hour plus away.
yeah,
Well, I mean, there's still a local congregation when certain members live hour and a half away from each other.
yeah.
So
Yeah, so I don't, I guess my answer would be, I don't know.
Yeah.
Is it technically possible? Maybe. If you ask me today, I wouldn't necessarily say absolutely it's not possible. But I think what we could all agree on is that it would be less than ideal, right? And there's certain, ideas, the idea of fellowship and some of the things that we're called to do as a part of that, right? Are difficult when there's geographic barriers in the way, and it certainly makes things harder as opposed to easier. But to Ryan's point, at what point do you draw the arbitrary line and say, okay, this is too far, but this is not, right?
And there's probably great wisdom in that there wasn't a hard and fast rule laid down authority wise,
Yeah.
Most of, go ahead, sorry.
I was gonna say, Hebrews 10 says we're supposed to assemble, and you can't assemble if you're at a home. I mean, I'm just saying. You're not assembling together. I mean. I just want to say, I didn't fulfill that.
Yeah,
You're
so
talking about Zoom?
Yeah.
Yeah, on the online today.
You're not assembling, you're not physically with those brethren. I went through COVID without ever doing an online service at all, so I just don't, I haven't ever wrapped my head around that.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
I
it's definitely,
understand
there's definitely some, you gotta spend some time deciding if, what, certainly physically, assembled, there's other thoughts and ideas around assembly, and again, certainly not ideal by any stretch of the imagination. All right, so point number 3. So the local church is a functioning body of believers, right? So in a minute, we'll talk about what the functions are that are to be carried out. The members of the local church are part of a collective group, and they function as a group. There's group activities that need to happen. And then, obviously the local church belongs to the Lord, in the same way that the universal general kind of generic church does as well. All right, so talk about this a little bit, but remember a little bit of review on our definition of the word church, right? An assembly, and then when you look at that English derivative, to me, that is like the absolute complete, really good definition. People called out people belonging to the Lord, right? The New Testament talks about the church as a called out people. So we're called into a fellowship with Christ, right there in 1 Corinthians, called into one body, and then we're called out of darkness into light, right? 1 Peter chapter 2. Really, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, which we have up here, it kind of gives another idea of what we're called into, right? We're called into the gospel. So starting in verse 13 there, we are bound to give thanks always to God for you, brethren, beloved of the Lord, because God has from the beginning chosen you to salvation through sanctification of the Spirit and belief of the truth, right? And then here's the part that we're interested in for our study today. Whereunto he called you by our gospel, right? So the gospel is the method by which we're called. So into Christ, out of darkness by the gospel, right? All right, so we're local, kind of by definition, is limited to a certain area or location, right? So really, it's just a people of a group of Christians that have joined together, decided to work together, do the work that's been given us by Christ. So you just look at what Paul, I guess this is Saul at this point, right? So just a couple examples of the local churches. So one in Jerusalem here, one in Galatia. There's obviously a bunch of other examples that we can use, right? But Acts chapter 8, and so talking about Stephen, and Saul was consenting to his death. And at that time, there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem, right? So the church and the Christians who were meeting together and working together in Jerusalem. And then over in Galatians chapter 1, all the brethren which are with me unto the churches of Galatia, right? So more than one, but still, this would be like churches in Texas, right? Kind of all the local groups that are here in Texas, same thing, churches of Galatia, all the local congregations in that area. All right, so the local church is a functioning body of believers, right? So again, it's important to make the distinction between there's not really any function given to the generic church, the universal church, right? Whereas there is specific functions that are given to the body of believers, and it has been organized accordingly, right? The organization that we have for the local church, which we're not going to spend a ton of time on today, but we will talk about some next week. But there is an organization, okay? And then the members of the local body are in fellowship or benefiting one another. One way to think about that as we accomplish the work together, the spiritual activities that we are given today. So what's in 2023, when people talk about fellowship, what are they typically referring to?
Food and entertainment.
Like coffee and donuts and whatever, right? Talking about your what you did for Thanksgiving and all those kinds of things, right? Is oftentimes the idea that people have in their mind around fellowship. So we'll look here in a minute at the scriptural definition of things, and we want to make sure that we use Bible words and Bible ways.
I have a question more about the certain, like the local branches, certain areas. Do we have a responsibility to our local area to go to that local church? Like say, because now we have so many like abundance of church, like just in DFW.
Sure.
They like, oh, I just prefer the people 45 minutes away instead of the one 10 minutes away. Do we have a responsibility to the one that's in our actual local area?
Yeah, that's a good point. So our mesquite reference, right? So people, okay, I'm pretty sure there's one even closer than Campbell Road. I think there may be a smaller group in Mesquite itself, right? So I don't know what any thoughts on that. That's a good. That's a good question. So
I think that's a hard question of why. If you're doing it because you have a beef with somebody, that you need to resolve. Then you know what I mean? I think that's a lot of questions of why. But it's hard, I think it'd be hard to invite your neighbor, like we're supposed to be spreading the gospel to our neighbors. How do you invite your neighbor when you say, oh, by the way,
Drive an
yes,
hour
there's
back
a
up.
local work 10 minutes from here, but I worship an hour and a half away, so come, like that would,
Which I think it's different, you know, with, you know, everyone lives far and the one congregation is here.
Sure.
But if there's a. this type of- just curious.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that come to mind for me. Number one, several lessons ago, and I think we either just barely hit on it at the end or ran out of time, but just kind of talking about the idea of the church, and it was a lesson where we talked about it's the body, it's the kingdom, right? And one of the points in that lesson was what it's not is like a social club, and not a social club right in that's our entertainment, right? But it's not, it shouldn't be a situation where, okay, I'm going to go and work with this group as long as I like everything that's going on. And as soon as there's something that I don't like, then I go down the road and I go do something else. And then I'm there for a while. And as soon as something happens that I don't like there, then I go down the road and I go to the next group. Right. So certainly we don't want that to happen. And just my experience,
that happens a lot.
I have seen that happen a lot. Right. It's just there's something I don't like. So I'm just going to go somewhere where really at the end of the day, we got to be careful that it's all about me and getting what I need and making sure that I'm happy. Right. So there's a balance between I want to get what I want and making sure that this is the best situation for, you know, my family. And there's a little bit of a balancing act that happens there, but it is a problem. And it's just, okay, this isn't what I want. I'm not happy here with it, you know, whatever. So I'm going to go drive an hour down the road. Right. Yeah.
I think you totally hit on it. I mean, and Ron and showing too, that it's really a heart issue or why you're doing it. Cause I can think when I was little, we lived here in Louisville. We started worshiping here at West Main when I was like really young, elementary. But then my uncle already moved up here and started preaching at Josie Lambs in Carrollton, not too far, but we had to drive past here to go there. But that was my uncle, my mom's brother-in-law, small congregation, we're supporting them. So that's why we decided to go there. But then people didn't necessarily want to come there as much because we didn't have elders for a really long time. So I mean, that's something else you have to consider. If your group doesn't have elders or not. And then I know like the Tartars, when they first moved to Louisville, they were going to Westside. And I remember Chris telling me one time after being going there a couple of years, they started coming here. The reason for switching is like, well, we're basically driving that much further to go to another good congregation when this congregation's just as faithful and strong as Westside.
Yeah.
That's why would we drive further? So I mean, it really comes down to judgment, but if the why is good and in accordance to God's will, I don't think there's anything that prohibits you from traveling to another congregation.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I would add, right, is that we are incredibly fortunate to have options and choices, right? That, hey, there's multiple places that can go.
Multiple
And
sound.
I can, that I can be a part of, and I can do what I'm
I
supposed to do.
think that's where the silence of scripture comes into it, and we have liberty in our Christian faith, and that we can then abuse that liberty in ungodly ways of, you know, church hopping or whatever it might be. I was talking to someone the other day. He said he was looking for a church that had a podium and still used the songbooks. And I was like, okay, you know, sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, it's
Okay, the songbooks I
just-
can understand.
just for an example, but you know, of the reasons to move to find another church, those probably aren't super high on
Yeah,
mature Christians list.
yeah.
I
So
really
it's-
wanna know more about that podium.
Yeah. So when I was in high school, so I grew up in Abilene. And so all of the sound churches there are maybe 80 people at the most. And so when I was in high school, it was me and my sister and there was 2 other kids that were our age,
Mhm.
right? I went to college. There was another, one of the other kids was the same age as me, and he left to go to college, so my sister was there with my sister and one other person. And there was a group across town where there's like, 12 kids in high school. So she talked to my parents and she's like, can I go over there? I said, sure, yeah, absolutely, right? So there's a little bit of, okay, what's the best situation, right? Big congregations, some people prefer small congregations, some people prefer, right? So there's a little bit of preference that comes into play in making some of those decisions, but that's a good thought question.
I had more Christian friends in my high school than I did where I worshiped, because we drove way out of town because my dad was preaching.
Yeah.
We drove past 6, 7 sound works
Yeah,
because my dad was preaching out of town.
sure,
And that kid factor is a large factor, because every church, especially small groups, they want children. But it's so hard to get people to stay with kids because there are no other kids.
yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah, that's really, it's, I don't want to say, I can't think of a better way to say it, like a dying congregation with no kids, right? Because if there's not the next generation to continue what's happening, then it eventually gives away. And that's actually exactly what happened to that congregation I grew up in. It doesn't exist anymore. It's completely gone. So that is unfortunate.
Okay. All right, so
The members of the local church are part of the collective body, right? And if you, let's flip over to Romans chapter 12, and let's spend a few minutes looking here, right? Because when Paul talks about the members of the local body here, he talks about them as being members of one another. So the slide has chapter 12 and verse 4 and 5, but we're going to back up to chapter 3, and I'm going to read from the ESV instead of the King James that's up there. But for by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. Okay. For as in one body we have many members, and members do not all have the same function. So we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another, right? So this idea that we're have this kind of symbiotic relationship to one another, right? So what does that mean to be members of one another? Well, if you look at verse 4, the 4 in verse 4, it kind of points back and looks back to verse 3. Well, what does verse 3 say? It says that we ought not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to, right? But each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. In other words, that we should think of others as equal to ourselves in the local group. We're all kind of on a level playing field. We're all peers. Would be maybe another way to say that. And so we're kind of looking at the end of verse 5. Okay. So we being many are one body in Christ, and every one members of another, right? That we should, so what does that mean? Another way to flesh that out or talk about is here in 1 Corinthians in chapter 12, right? We don't want any division, okay? But the members should have the same care for one another, right? Kind of like we talked about, just talked about before. So what does it mean to care for each other? Well, anxious about, right? You're concerned about, you take thought, you think about other people. It's kind of that the idea of worry, right? If you care about someone, you worry about them, right? Everyone here has kids, right? You care about your children, you worry about what they're doing, you worry about them when they're away from you, you worry about who they're with, you worry about the choices that they're getting, right? All of these things. There's a little bit of anxiety that comes along with that idea of caring for one another. Same thing with each other, right? So when I was in the military, right, they talk about some of the PTSD type things, and this has always stuck with me. Pain shared is lessened, right? Joy shared is increased. So when you have a bad experience, the more that you're able to share that with other people and talk about what's going on, you kind of unload a little bit of that pain to all of them and let them carry it for you, right? When you have joy, and the good things that happen, and you share that with other people, you offload that joy to them, and now they're carrying joy and happiness around with them. And I think that's very much kind of the idea that's laid out here.
There's a principle all through the scriptures of circles of responsibility. So first I'm responsible for myself, and then I'm responsible for my family, and then from there my church family, and then the greater world. And I think the same applies to like within the local body. So like when Bill Allen fell, the first responsibility goes to Eastside because that is his church family. But we can also care for Bill because of our connection through Linda. We love Linda, so by extension, we also love Bill. And it's proper for us then to pray for Bill and to check out on him and see what we can also do to help, because we also know Eastside's a smaller group and elderly. So maybe there's a way that we could help in them, even though we're not immediately obligated to look after them. We have the ability to care for them in that way.
Sure. So talked about California actually earlier, but there was a guy who was in the Navy in California, and he had flown back somewhere on the East Coast, and then they were driving back from wherever they were, Arkansas actually. They flew to Arkansas, and then they were driving back California, and something happened. They pulled over on the side of the road. He went around to the back of the car to look in the trunk, and a truck hydroplaned off the road, hit him just right outside of Abilene, and he lost both legs just instantly, right? And so he ended up being in the hospital in Abilene for a couple months. He was a member of the church, and so they started trying to find out what the local church was in Abilene, get in touch with the elders, and then get in touch with my dad. And so they spent, kind of did shifts at the hospital because it was just him and his wife, and she was also in the hospital, not nearly as bad shape as he was, but right. And they just kind of assumed them in to the local group. So, and 3 months later, they finally flew him back out to the Navy hospital in California. But it's I guess a good example of care, and a good example of an appropriate way for congregations to work together, right, to accomplish things. But yeah, we can do things because of the relationships that we have with people, and even though that we don't know them directly, we care about this person, so by extension, we care about the people that they care about, right?
Okay. We'll go up. So question 7.
What collective responsibilities members of a local church have? So what are some things that you can think of? There's a couple very low-hanging fruit ones that we can be able to grab.
Worship.
Yeah, we got to worship, right? Wade talked about earlier, California scenario, contributing to the collection, the treasury. I already want to talk about that.
Right. So there's a number of different things.
Assemble regularly for worship, the collection to support the work, function as a collective unit, support the preaching of the gospel, take care of needy saints, and then send relief to other churches as a need arose. And it's interesting, right? None of that required kind of inner congregational alliances forming so that there's some kind of joint control by many churches or control of one church over the activities of the other, right? So a lot of what oftentimes, or you may hear people refer to us as antis on a lot of things, right? Specifically orphans and those kind of things. I don't think anybody's anti-orphan. I think all of us would be happy to support orphans. We do in India, a bunch of folks do. And so it's not that isn't important, right? It's just that there's an appropriate way in which that should be done, and it doesn't really require any of these collective multi-church arrangements. It works just fine, right? You think about the preachers that we support. Usually we're one of 5 or 6 or 7 different congregations that is contributing money towards the work that they're doing, right? And it works just fine. They all send money to the preacher, and he is able to support himself and continue on the work. And it's really that simple. Sometimes we tend to overcomplicate things and make them harder than they really ought to be, but it really is that simple. Ryan's doing something I want him to continue doing, I'm going to send him some money, right? It's really as simple as that, and he's gonna kind of report back to me, and as long as he's doing stuff that I think is right, I'm gonna continue sending money. When he does something I don't think is right, I'll stop sending money, right? I mean, it's not really a complicated, not really a terribly complicated process.
You can see God's wisdom in it, because as structure and layers are involved, the corruption, especially when money's involved, money gets siphoned off for other things.
Yeah, you start administrative costs, all those kinds of things.
But charities get ratings on how well they actually spend their charitable funds, and most of them are terrible.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's not very, again, back to my military experience, they would give you a list of charities, right? And then they would say this percentage of what you donate goes to the actual charity, right? Which is incredibly useful. You have someone where I'm contributing $5 goes to the actual charity, I'm gonna find somewhere else to contribute my money because it's not doing what I want it to do, right? So yeah, there's all kinds of administrative costs and things that start to go sideways there.
I had to think a lot about this, and I still do, as far as vetting preachers and other things of like, well, does this mean that I have to, stick my fingers in my ears and not paying attention to what someone else says from another congregation? No, I don't see that in that. I can talk and say, hey, this guy says y'all are sending $500 a month to him. Is that true? He's, oh yeah, that is true. Okay, what has your experience been? Blah, blah. It's just due diligence on stewardship on our part. But if it's like, okay, there's 2 or 3 churches. All right, here, let's all get together. All right, let's plan. We want to, jointly, we want to support this guy. We'll send 300. You send this. Like that's going on the track where the autonomy of the elders' decision making at that point isn't what the scriptures say. I guess that's kind of how I've seen it. So
yeah, and really, if you think about if all of the, so like I said, we usually have 5, 6, 7 different congregations that are contributing, right? So what if Joanne gets, kind of like Ben here, right? Gets 100% of the financial support from one place. Well, it's now beholden to the elders, and right, it has the different situation when you have one church using all of your funds. Okay, now I've got to kind of fall in line. That would certainly be the tendency in the way that people would tend to think about it. Whereas if you have, not that there's anything wrong with that, right? But when it's coming from multiple locations, now it's less likely for it to be, okay, here's West Main and our satellite campus over here that we're 100% supporting the preachers. Because again, that's going on a lot today as well, for sure.
But, and again, the layers of responsibility. Ideally, the local church supports their own preacher.
Yep.
This is only in the scenario where they can't.
Yeah, sure.
And we're thrilled when we can drop a preacher from the support because they are able to now support their own preachers.
Yeah, that's a fantastic day. That's what you want, right? So you want that group to grow, where they support their own preacher. Now outside funds aren't needed. Let's go send it somewhere else and do it all over again. Right?
Okay.
So, more of the local church, right, obviously belongs to the Lord, made up of those who've been purchased by the blood of Christ. That's the case for each individual member. And as we've talked about before, kind of the name is important and matters, and those groups should reflect the appropriate headship and ownership.
Okay.
So let's talk about this a little bit. What does the word fellowship mean? So we said it didn't mean donuts and coffee. So what does it mean? At least not in the biblical sense. It doesn't mean donuts and coffee. Right?
All right. So there's the Greek
Word. And I'm by no means a Greek scholar, right? Something in common, right? There's lots of synonyms for what that means. Fellowship, association, community, communion, joint participation. That word,
the one in blue. I'm not even
going to try and pronounce it right. When you talk about Greek, the root word of that, phoneos, Greek, is what the New Testament was written in. In other words, it's the common Greek language. It's the Greek that everyone understood and spoke collectively together. And so that's the same idea, this word here, right? That everyone has something in common. There's something that we're all doing together. Okay, Acts chapter 2, they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship. Right, so there's kind of a couple different ideas of fellowship. There's the idea of giving fellowship, there's the idea of receiving fellowship, and then there's kind of theoretical fellowship, which is kind of what this is here, right? They continued in the apostles' doctrine and in fellowship, and in breaking bread and in prayer. Philippians kind of shows a different version of that. For your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now. So he has got to talk about receiving fellowship in 2 Corinthians, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministering to the saints, right? So kind of this outgoing fellowship. So there's a couple different ways to kind of think about that. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're participating in a relationship where we are both benefiting. Really, that's kind of the core idea of fellowship, is that there's some benefit and functioning that flows both ways, right?
That's easy to see with collective singing. I can sing praises to God and glorify God by myself, but I am not in fellowship with my saints unless we are together singing.
Yep.
And we can understand each other because we're all singing the same song. It's not done in chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's try to figure out what I want to do with the last 2 minutes here. So here's what I'll do for the last 2 minutes, because I want to throw this question out there for you to think about. So the real life scenario, there was a congregation that had a member, and their gospel spreading effort was to tell people, if you are not a member of the Church of Christ, you're going to hell. That was their evangelical methodology, right? So I guess, is that an appropriate statement, or I guess, is that a true statement or not, number one? And then number two, is that an appropriate evangelical, or not evangelical, but evangelistic effort? And then number three, if it is appropriate way to evangelize people, at what point in the conversation does that idea get introduced or interjected? Probably, in other words, you probably shouldn't lead with that, I guess it would be my so at what point does that come up? Right, so leave you at that. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit next week. So hopefully everybody has a good Thanksgiving, and we'll See you next Sunday.